Gary Mary, I'm honored to be in discussion with you today to discuss N Street Village's history. You were one of the leaders who was there when it all began 50 years ago. And over the years, Gary, you've served N Street Village in a number of different capacities. You were one of the founding architects. I know you were a volunteer who worked at the overnight shelter. You've been a member of the N Street Village Board of Directors, and that's not at all an exhaustive list. You've been really embedded in N Street Village. Walk us through, if you would, the climate and what was going on in Washington, D.C. when N Street Village was first emerging.
Margaret and I came to D.C. at the end of 1967 and somehow made our way to Luther Place in early 1968. And we were both from rural areas, had no clue about the city. And April the 4th, 1968, 10 days before we got married, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, and that day will always be imprinted on my mind. We lived in the city, and we had an apartment on the 9th floor, and we watched the city, including 14th Street, go up in smoke that day. I had no clue what was happening. There was such anger, assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, anger, and 14th Street went up in flames. So there were a lot of destruction. People were just so angry, and they looted and set some of the buildings on fire. The church has been sitting here for 150 years. The church has gone through many periods. In the 60s, it had become a metropolitan church and largely a suburban congregation, people coming in from Virginia, Maryland, some from DC, but more from suburbs. And they'd come in on Sunday. And after this traumatic event, people were afraid to come into the city. 300 people left the church in the next 2 years.
Wow.
There was a lot of turmoil. The church did open its doors that day and was a place of respite and a place of food and clothing distribution for 4 or 5 days during that period. It was controversy for the church. Some of the members didn't feel comfortable. And then, as I said, people started leaving the church for the suburbs where they lived anyway. And but a core stayed, and Margaret and I were committed, living in the city, committed to helping. And so I started nibbling around the edges, talking to some of the older congregants who would become my mentors. And the church leadership, and there were some key leaders who I worked with. They decided that we needed a pastor who had inner city experience, and ended up calling John Steinbrook, who would be here for 27 years and was a mentor to me. And then, even more importantly, was Chuck Solom and Dale McDaniel were members of the council and leadership of the church. And so they drew me in about 1970, just shortly after John Steinbrook came, and I wanted to do something. I didn't know what. And so I said yes and joined this council. Little did I know that saying yes would forever change my life. June of 1970, joining the council. And then there started to be talk about N Street. And that was the beginning.
So through the 70s and 80s, essentially those dilapidated row houses that had been bought for a little over $300,000 were transformed. And some people have called it a smorgasbord of services were being provided from those row houses. Is there a unifying theme, Gary, about what was happening on N Street during that time and for the last half century?
I think that was the unifying thing, welcoming the stranger. And we began, my wife Margaret, Ernest Steinbrook, John's wife, and a few other women of the church came together to opened Deborah's Place in late 1973, which was the first house for women. It's the only house that was torn down in the development. It would have been in the courtyard. Mm-hmm. It was Deborah's Place for 8 women in transition. Mm-hmm. And I remember all of those weekends, scraping those walls and repainting and cleaning up the place. And they were in pretty bad shape. And then N Street started to emerge. With Sarah House in 1980, we recognized that the women who were coming here, many were dual diagnosed with mental illness and drug addiction. So Sarah House was opened in 1980. And then Ernest Steinbrook was a big mover behind Bethany, which opened on the corner house in 1983.
Can you explain to me what Bethany was?
So Bethany was a day center for the homeless women in the city. And they would come in for breakfast in the morning and lunch, and we began to have mostly volunteers at that time, but began to have that as a place for, beginning to encounter the women and beginning to understand their needs. And that helped shape our future programs, is, getting to know the women.
And there's still, Bethany Day Center still exist. Right. And outside of COVID,
we're hoping soon reopens, yes.
365 days a year. Right. It's opening and welcoming the stranger. Now, while Luther Place Memorial Church owned the property, and it was central in creating, designing, and developing the supportive social services at N Street Village, this was a collaborative and interreligious process. Can you tell me about this? It wasn't just the Lutherans.
That was a very important part. John Steinbrook, when he did ministry up in Pennsylvania, he had worked with on an interreligious basis in the inner city. And he felt that was important. And so he started reaching out to, other religious communities. And an interesting development. I don't know if you remember the issue of Soviet Jewry.
I do.
In the 1970s, Soviet Jews were being persecuted in Russia. Interesting, we're talking about Russia again. And so the Jewish community began to protest in front of the Soviet embassy on 16th Street in 1970.
Here in Washington, D.C.
Right here on 16th Street, not only 4 blocks from the church. And John befriended several people in the Jewish community, Norm Goldstein being one of those who's still a supporter today of N Street Village. And John started every day for 15 minutes, John would stand in with the Jewish community in front of the Soviet embassy. And we congregants on Sundays and on high holy days would stand in with the Jewish community in front of the Soviet embassy. We'd take our kids, walk down 4 blocks to the Soviet embassy. So the Jewish community said, what can we do for you? What can we do with you? And John said, well, we've got some property over here, which we're calling N Street Village, and we'd love to have you involved. And so that started a relationship.
It feels as if where there is a need, N Street and Luther Place started providing the services. But there is a pivotal point that sort of directed N Street to where N Street is now, and that was the winter of 1976. Tell me what happened that winter.
Yeah, well, you mentioned 1972, so the founding was actually November of 1972, and that was pretty much just a legal document to separately incorporate N Street Village because we started to get donors, and we needed to have an independent entity to receive those donations. But there was a vision, N Street Village, let's create a village. And there was the inspiration and the thinking at that time. We had no clue what that would be, but we had a dream of a village. The winter of 1976 was a particularly cold winter in D.C., and we literally had homeless dying on our doorsteps at Luther Place and around this neighborhood. And so the Community for Creative Nonviolence, Mitch Snyder, who I could talk about a long time, he was instrumental in creating the medical center, the KS Medical Clinic. Some of the Community for Creative Nonviolence actually lived in one of our houses. So Mitch and sojourners who are still active in the community put out a call to all the congregations in the metropolitan area. They said they sent out some 1,000 letters for churches to open their doors. And Luther Place was the only church that agreed to open their doors. And so John took it to council, and somehow Chuck Solom persuaded the council that we should open our doors the next day. One Sunday afternoon, we had the council meeting after church. And so I was here the first night in the basement of Luther Place, and we had men and women. We had no restrictions, men and women. There may be a few kids, over 100 people sleeping on mats on the floor of Luther Place Church. And it was a bit of chaos, but we had CCNV helping to staff it. And I was there, and a couple of other members from Luther Place. But pretty quickly, we decided that having men and women in the same facility was just not going to work. And Mitch Snyder already had housing, emergency shelter for men. And Erna was particularly inclined toward the women. So she said,
Erna Steinbrook,
John's wife. So she said, we really need to focus on women. So that was the turning point. But we said that started to become our mission, homeless women.
Wow.
And we started to build from there.
And that service to women in our community was well established in 1993 when I came around. I was a lifelong Lutheran, went to Lutheran high school, and a friend told me about Luther Place, and I showed up here, and I was really impressed with this congregation that was engaged in lifting the most vulnerable in our community. That was important to me. And two of the many services that N Street was providing in 1993 were Bethany Day Center, 365 days a year, open and welcoming women with meals and other supportive services, and then the overnight shelter. And that was the overnight shelter at that point was housed on the 4th floor of Luther Place. And there were volunteers from all different faiths and people from all walks of life and communities that were coming, and they were essential to keeping the overnight. That's the way it was at that point, to keeping the overnight shelter going. There were volunteers. Right. And my husband and I were two of those volunteers. We'd come and we'd spend the night. And every time we signed up on the little calendar, I noticed that Gary Meering and Margaret Meering were signed up to be overnight volunteers in the shelter, and that entailed engaging with the women, about 35 to 40 women in the evening, and then sleeping in the office. We slept on those little bed/cots in the office, and then engaging with the women again in the morning. And you and Margaret were regular volunteers in that capacity. What made you want to contribute and participate in that way, Gary?
Well, I described my early engagement in 1970 and being part of the council, and then what we called the Forward Planning Committee, which began to plan for the future of N Street. And Margaret was already engaged with, Deborah's Place. And and then she was also involved in the board of Abraham Welcome House, and that was just kind of the next step for us. This was where the need was as volunteers. So I felt that I needed to be on the front lines as well as serving on, committees and, planning. And I needed to understand on the front line what was happening. And so what you didn't mention, we actually gave the women their meds, amazingly. In the evening, we gave the women their meds, and in the morning, their meds.
I know. At nighttime, I did that too, and I'm thinking, but I'd been an RA, a resident assistant in college, so I felt like when I was 20 years old, I had more responsibility than I actually had earned, and in that way. But it worked out, and I always felt, and I'm sure you and Margaret did too, that I received more from the women than I gave. I learned a lot.
Absolutely, and I'll comment on that later. But those experiences sleeping overnight there. Occasionally we'd have a crisis. Women were supposed to be in by a certain hour. Occasionally they didn't make it. And then, occasionally there would be some kind of a crisis. But we somehow managed through it.
Right.
And with volunteers. And so there was one director of the night programs, but she was a day person, and we were it.
You were the staff
for
at
the night.
The volunteers staffed it overnight, which was
pretty amazing.
By the time we got to the late 80s and early 90s, there were a number of different programs for women that N Street was supporting on this block and in the nearby community. But in another turning point, there is a decision to launch a multi-year effort to raise $19.5 million to build the flagship location where we're sitting today. That was a really audacious goal, I think, but it was achieved through a combination of individual contributions, through government grants, through loans, and low-income tax credit. So there was all cobbled together. I remember this was still being worked on when I first joined. It was it was still in process. You were deeply engaged in that process. Tell me a little bit about those times and some of the key contributors and some of the hurdles, because I saw some of the hurdles that were encountered.
So part of the dream was eventually to build something here that would house all of these programs and have, permanent housing, supportive and low and moderate income housing facility on this block. And, had we known all the hurdles that we would face, we probably wouldn't have started. But
I'm glad you didn't know.
Little did we know. So in the late 80s, yes, we hired a fundraiser by the name of Steve Sharp, and that's another story. So Connie Sharp was our administrator at the church. So Connie was behind the scenes running the scene, and then her brother was a fundraiser at Lutheran colleges. And so we hired Steve, and so he undertook an audacious campaign to raise $8 million for N Street. And somehow John Steinbrook got us connected through PMI, the parking management firm, with Abe Poland, who owned the sports teams in D.C. So Abe was the co-chair of the campaign committee, and we raised $8 million. And John was good friends with the chaplain of the House of Representatives, Jim Ford, and somehow they got to know a Lutheran congressman from Michigan, and he sponsored a $5 million grant through HUD to develop a model housing community for formerly homeless women. And so we got a congressional grant through HUD for $5 million. And then, fortunately, Henry Bowden was a member of our congregation, and he was a developer in the city. And so we hired Henry to assist us in the development process. So he got us an architect that was savvy about historic preservation and all of that, Saram Baronis. And he also knew about low-income tax credits, which had come just in that period. It was a government program to give tax credits for low-income housing. And so Henry helped walk us through that process, and we got another $5.3 million of low-income tax credits. And so kind of pieced it together.
Adding up. Yeah, you pieced it together. It's
Not
adding up.
Not quite there yet, but.
Right.
And then took out a mortgage. Luther Place underwrote the mortgage for near $2 million. And the development was underway, but it was not easy. We had to get all these permits. The Logan Circle community were opponents. They fought us all the way.
I remember, Gary, people marching into church on Sunday with pickets saying, "Do not build N Street here."
And there was a letter put out in the community. We were going to build a 400-bed shelter at N Street, and the community was up in opposition about all this. But our friend was Mayor Barry. So Mayor Barry came through the civil rights era. I don't know how many will remember Mayor Barry, but he's twice mayor of the city. And John befriended him as a social activist, And Mayor Barry got us through the process. He assured that we got the right permits just a day before something was supposed to happen with historic preservation that might have precluded us going in. So we
then we got
to construction, and then that, of course, took longer than you could
Sure.
imagine. So 2 years after starting construction, December of 1996.
And you were here in December 1996 for the grand opening of N Street's flagship location.
Hallelujah! And Mayor Barry was out front, but I have a picture of him with his arms raised, celebrating. He was a mayor in the second term then, and all the founders were there, and all the development community and the banks who helped finance it were all there. On this side of the building were the transitional programs for women, plus permanent supportive housing, and on the other side was 51 apartments, low and moderate income for singles or families.
It was just incredible. 1996 it opened.
December 96, yes.
Yeah. Can you reflect a bit on what that opening of the flagship location meant to the most vulnerable in our community and in our city?
Well, it was a long dream to have a permanent facility, and so to finally realize that was a sigh of relief. And then it was not easy. I mean, the finances were just not there. We were losing money. We put every cent into the development, and then had to operate a building. Mm-hmm. And we were losing money. So this first couple of years, it was dicey. It was kind of desperate. Where were we going to find the cash to keep it going? And so that was all. We celebrated for a day or two, but then it was operating a building like this with all those programs.
So there were some really tough economic times, but N Street Village made it through. And now here we are, 25 years since the flagship location opened. And during that last 2.5 decades, N Street has continued to evolve, right? And now the village incredibly includes 8 locations throughout the city. And N Street is the largest provider of housing and supportive services for women experiencing homelessness in Washington, D.C. It's kind of incredible. Tell me, what do you think is at the heart of N Street and its mission?
Well, that, original concept of hospitality and welcoming all, particularly the most impoverished, and it gradually became women in need, and we gradually began to know the women through Bethany and through the programs, and began to understand their needs, and so the programs were modified and grown, and then we had a remarkable expansion period that I would have never envisioned way back then. That happened since 2011. And let's just walk through that for a minute. 2011, we merged with Miriam's House, which was a house for women with HIV/AIDS up on Florida Avenue in Northwest. And Tim Fritz, who's one of our staff, he and his wife founded that house for women who literally were coming there to die, when, the original AIDS patients. But by that time, AIDS, there was medication for AIDS, and women were living longer. And for one reason or another, Miriam's House was struggling, and their mission was very close to ours. And, we always had 10 to 15% of our women who had AIDS. And so it was a natural merger and we had more resources than they did. And so some of their board, came onto our board, and staff, Tim came over with us. And then a year later, Ernest's House over on 11th Street, the city recognized, N Street Village role with women, and they asked us to to take over a house they were renovating for women. And this was our first experience with the housing first model that came out of New York. So the idea was to take the most chronically homeless women off the streets and put them in housing first, and then deal with all the problems that they had. So Ernest House was our first experience with the housing first model, and we still, of course, operate that for 31 women, just 4 blocks from here. That was in 2012, and named after Ernest Steinbrück.
Pastor Steinbrück's wife.
Right. And then came along in 2016 2 more openings. The Phyllis Wheatley, the YWCA up on Rhode Island Avenue at 9th Street, was renovated in partnership with the city and a developer to turn that YWCA into single-room occupancy housing for women, for 80 women, and city contracted with us to provide supportive services to 42 women at Phyllis Wheatley. And then that same year, the city came to us to open the new Pat Handy shelter over on 5th Street as an emergency shelter for 213 women. And wow, was that
a huge growth.
Was that an undertaking?
Right.
I have to say, I mean, the leadership we've had at N Street Village, and I've worked with them all over the years, just remarkable. We had a major transition. I mean, Schroeder was here for nearly 2 decades, and
Schroeder
Striebling was our executive director. She came as our program director, and I worked with her on programs, and then she became our executive director and eventually converted to CEO. And so that was a remarkable journey, and Stuart, our development director. And so that era transition, but Kenyatta was here. Kenyatta came in 2016, and she had great experience going back to Catholic Charities, and she ran our programs for, since 2016. So she's had hands-on experience with women, and no one better to lead us into the next era.
To be the CEO of N Street.
N Street Village, our new CEO. And so I'm so proud that Kenyatta is our new CEO. Then we had, in more recent times, in 2020, the addition of more city working with developers to provide at least some of the low-income housing in their developments. It's been an effort over the last 10 years. And so now we operate permanent supportive housing in Diane's house, I think 42 units, and Capitol Vista 22 or 24 units, both opened in 2020. And now we are, the 8th location is not really a location, it's rapid rehousing. The city started rapid rehousing, and that came as a national model, and the city started probably 10 years ago for mostly with families initially, to people who were struggling economically, needed short-term help economically. So the idea was to provide them rent support for a year to 18 months while they got back on their feet, got employment. And it would be scattered locations working with landlords. And so the city started moving into singles in the last couple of years, and N Street was asked to begin the rapid rehousing model for single women. And so we are now, I think we have authority to house 13 women in scattered locations working with landlords around.
And you sit on one of the city committees, right?
And all of this has been happening through the leadership of Mayor Bowser and the Interagency Council on Homelessness, which incorporates several city agencies that deal with housing, and the nonprofits. And I'm still a member of the Strategic Planning Committee of the Interagency Council. And Kenyatta just recently got selected to be on the Executive Committee of the Interagency Council. And Schroeder, before she left, was co-chairing the Interagency Council on Homelessness. So Mayor Bowser, when she came in 2015, the staff was already working on a plan called Homer DC to end chronic homelessness in the city. So that got adopted in 2015, a 5-year strategic plan. Obviously, we didn't make it to end chronic homelessness in the city, so it got extended another 5 years until 2025. So everything that we are doing is in concert with the city agencies, and it is a plan to end homelessness. And shamelessly promoting my book, sitting on the Interagency Council, I have a chapter, chapter 6, about the case study on homelessness in DC and highlight N Street Village's role as part of that Interagency Council.
So your book is seeking the common good
through public policy.
Through public policy. So N Street was getting and continues to get a lot of notice from the city and even from some esteemed folks like Oprah Winfrey and the Dalai Lama. What do you think draws their attention? Tell me about, Oprah gave $1 million donation to N Street Village, and the Dalai Lama came to visit and engaged with the women in the village. Tell me, what do you think draws them in? Tell me, you were there for those events. Tell me a little bit about it.
So 2007, in this very room, we hosted the Dalai Lama for an hour, 2 hours. The Dalai Lama came to DC, and I don't remember what the original motivation was, but of course he got invited to the White House. And we had a supporter at the White House staff, and I'm not remembering his name, but the Dalai Lama expressed an interest in the issue of homelessness and visiting a site. And so one day we get a call from the White House, can you host the Dalai Lama at N Street Village? Sure. And fortunately, for the women, he was just so compassionate with the women, touched their face, and they, just a remarkable person, and it was just a remarkable time. He's talked about this is trying times, but I have hope for the 21st century. And, he expressed, some of his background, what happened to him, driven out of Tibet. But he had hope for the future, and just smiling and compassionate. And women just loved it.
There's something about N Street that you'd have Oprah Winfrey, which most people around the world know, and the Dalai Lama, who'd be interested in coming to N Street and understanding what's going on here.
Yeah. And then the 2016, we did an annual luncheon every June, and one of our board members was able to get Oprah to come to our annual luncheon. And of course, Oprah being there was just amazing to us. And the women, as with our gala, several of the women gave their testimony. And we were about to wrap up, and Oprah signaled she wants to come out. And she said, I am so overwhelmed, I'm going to give $1 million to N Street Village. And I think it seemed spontaneous to me.
Right.
And we just said, oh my God.
It was incredible.
That's one of those moments. I funded 3 new programs which are operating now, which is the vocational center, which I think is just getting back up and operating. The holistic program on the 5th floor was a modification to the programming that we had on the 5th floor before. It's a holistic approach to bringing women out of homelessness. And then Evelyn Green, who I need to talk about, the greenhouse. So Evelyn was a client in N Street Village. And I remember Evelyn coming in 1990 and Ernest Steinbrook working with her. And Evelyn really wanted to come out of homelessness. She had been on the street for 25 years. And she tried, but failed that first time. She came back again a few months later, and Ernest took her under her wing and said, we're gonna make it happen this time, Evelyn. And she did. And she eventually became a staff member. She's been staff for more than 25 years.
And she's a bedrock of this community.
She ran Bethany for many years. And then after Oprah's grant, she became director of Greenhouse. She's working with the most vulnerable women as kind of a mentor to them. So that was another remarkable.
It's an incredible story.
Yeah.
From being a client to running one of the programs and to continue to work in the community.
And Evelyn's a great friend, and I highlight her in my book. Her story, I think, is one that needs to be told.
Gary, do you want to offer any other personal reflections on your 50 years of involvement with N Street Village?
Yeah, I think as you suggested early on, I think I've really gotten more from N Street than I have given. I mean, it's transformed my life, and getting to know the women has been life-changing. Understanding what those women have gone through, the trauma that they have faced. Survey a couple of years ago was really of homeless women, and Kenyatta was involved in that. We realized how much trauma the women have faced in their lives in so many ways, both, abuse in the home or spousal abuse, or but then living on the street for 20 years. I mean, horrendous stories. So our programs are more trauma-informed now. That's terminology that we're using that really recognizing Kenyatta's survey really helped us better understand the women's needs. But anyway, I have learned so much from those women, and Portia, you and I both know so many of those women. So many go to Luther Place, and they have been friends for a long, long time, and they have taught us both.
Right.
Taught us so much.
So 50 years ago, it's been 50 years. And 50 years ago, it would have been hard to imagine N Street as it exists today. How do you envision N Street Village will be in the years to come?
Well, I think we're on a clear path now, as I was saying, with the city. We are a partner with many of the other providers in the city, family providers, providers for men, and we are the premier for women. And a strategic plan to end chronic homelessness. The vision still is, of the city plan, is there will always be homelessness, but we want it to be as short as possible and non-recurring. So there will be short intervals, no more than 90 days of homelessness, and we'll have a woman in housing. So we are in concert with the city's strategic plan to end chronic homelessness. We don't want to. There's just too much recurrence of homelessness.
I have over these years watched you and Margaret, Joe and I have, and I'm grateful for your service to Luther Place and to N Street, particularly as we recognize that you were there. You were one of the architects that helped build what N Street is today. Thank you, Gary.
And thank you, Portia. Yeah, I've been with you for 30 years, and we have done so much together, not only N Street, other social justice initiatives, and we've been great partners. And I love working with you, Portia. And so glad you were the one that asked me the questions. I felt so comfortable.
I felt comfortable.
Thank you.
Thank you.